Hi, my name is Bill Graham. Today we're going to talk a little bit about improvising using chord tones. So before formal jazz education really became a thing and solidified modal thinking or chord scale theory as the way that the vast majority of jazz improvisers learn how to think about things, back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, even into the 60s and 70s, really, the way that everybody thought about improvising was to play the chord tones and to lead into those chord tones with various different approaches. So playing a step, a half step, or a whole step below the chord tone, step above the chord tone, a step above and then a step below the chord tone, a step below and then a step above, two above, one below, one above, two below, all sorts of different combinations. So that's how they thought about things. They also thought about what key they were in, what key center the tune happened to be visiting at the moment, if it was going somewhere other than the main key. And also some substitutions they started to think about as they got a little bit more into the bebop era. We don't have time to talk about those today, but we're definitely going to get to those in the future. Anyway, now I'm definitely not saying that knowing the modes doesn't have value. You should definitely learn them. However, if you think about a list of master jazz improvisers, just undisputed masters, like we're talking people like Louis Armstrong, Lester Young, Teddy Wilson, Roy Eldridge, Charlie Christian, Art Tatum, Charlie Parker, Bud Powell, Dizzy Gillespie, Coleman Hawkins, Dexter Gordon, Sonny Stitt, Sonny Rollins, Barry Harris, Clifford Brown, right? These people were not thinking about modes. Charlie Parker didn't know what a Lydian dominant scale was. Roy Eldridge had no idea what a Phrygian scale was. That's just not the terms that they were thinking in. So, definitely learn your modes and know about them. However, if you want to sound authentic, if you want to sound idiomatic, playing Great American Songbook, jazz standards, songs that have chord progressions that are in keys, you got to know about playing the chord tones and approaching the chord tones with these various different approaches. And honestly, if you want to sound good playing modal jazz, you got to know about this stuff too, because all of the masters of that music, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Herbie Hancock, Freddie Hubbard, Chick Corea, Dave Liebman, Pat Metheny. All right, so these players are masters of nailing the chord changes. They're playing the chord tones. They're leading into the chord tones with all the different approach concepts. And when they play in a modal context or play more modal vocabulary, they're playing it in addition to all the vocabulary we've talked about so far. In fact, they're playing that modal stuff through a prism of really primarily understanding this music in terms of the chord tones and getting into those chord tones. So, when jazz educators and jazz students start off working on those modal concepts before they have a firm foundation of those fundamental concepts, they're doing themselves a real disservice. And I know, because I read a certain jazz piano book and a certain jazz theory book by an author who will remain nameless, and those books held me back for years and years. So I cannot emphasize enough the importance of learning your arpeggios and learning to lead into those arpeggios with all these different approach concepts. So today, we're going to learn some examples over the bridge of rhythm changes. Let's get right into it. Actually, before we get into the examples, let's just real quick go over some of the different approach concepts. So we could approach each chord tone from a step below. Let's try a half step below each chord tone. So let's take a C chord and how about from a half step above? Okay. What about two notes below? How about chromatic to begin with? Or two notes above? Okay. How about one note above and one note below? Or chromatic? How about three notes up into the chord tone? Sometimes diatonic, sometimes chromatic. Or three notes down into a chord tone. Okay. or one note above and two notes below. Or two notes above and one note below. Okay, all sorts of different combinations that we can play. Okay, so when we say rhythm changes, we're talking about the chords to George Gershwin's I've Got Rhythm. Now, I've Got Rhythm is in B flat, and the bridge starts on D7. So in the key of B flat, D7 is 5 of 6, right? Because in B flat, the 6th chord is G minor, and so we're going to borrow D7 from the key of G minor. That would normally resolve right there, right? But instead, it resolves into a G7. So that G7 is now 5 of 2, and it's pointing towards a C minor chord, right? So we've got D7 going to G7, and you expect that's going to go to C minor, but it doesn't. It goes to C7. Okay, so we've got a little dominant chain happening here. So in the key of B flat, C7 is 5 of 5. Right, so that heads straight to F7. That takes us back home. Okay, so we just got 2 bars of each one of those chords. 5 of 6, which leads straight into 5 of 2, which leads straight into 5 of 5, and that leads straight into 5, and that finally takes us back to 1. Okay, so let's take a look at these lines. Okay, so notice how on the last beat or two of every one of these examples, instead of playing on the current chord, we start targeting a note from the next chord. This is a really important concept to understand in order to effectively play through the chord changes instead of just playing over each chord. We'll start with some straightforward arpeggios, add in some mostly diatonic decorations, and then we'll start getting a little more chromatic with things. 2, 1, 2, 3. So this one was just all simple arpeggios. The last beat of each chord anticipates the next chord. Let's take a closer look at it. So we're starting on D7, right? And we run up from the 3rd. Just play the simple triad arpeggio, and then back down the chord. Okay? And now as we lead into G7, we're going to start with some G notes. Great, and then just back down the chord. Now we're going to lead into C7. And now into F7. And then we end on the 3rd of B flat. So let's hear that at tempo one more time. 2, 1, 2, 3. One, two, three. Okay, so this one starts off with that same little basic D major arpeggio. But then on beat 4 of the first measure, we're going to play a 2-note diatonic approach up to the 5th of the chord. We play that 5th on beat 1 of the second bar. That note goes up to its diatonic upper neighbor before just playing chord tones for the rest of the bar until we get ready to lead into this G7. So we're going to lead into the 5th of that chord with 1 note, a diatonic approach from above. All right, and then we're going to hang out on just G arpeggio notes. And now we're going to play a 2-note approach up into the root of C7. 2-note diatonic approach into the third, 2-note diatonic approach into the fifth, and we just walk down to the root, skip down to the third. Now we're going to play a 2-note diatonic approach into the third of F7. And then a 2-note diatonic approach up into the fifth, but now we're going to play a chromatic lower neighbor, and then back up to the root, up to the third, walk down to the root. We're going to play the lower neighbor, come back up to the root, and then just finish up with arpeggio notes. And we can really look at this C as being a diatonic 1-note approach down into the root of B flat 6. Okay, so let's play that one more time. 2, 1, 2, 3. Okie doke. 1, 2, 3. Okay, cool. This one's starting to get a little bit more chromatic. We're going to start with a chromatic 1 above, 2 below approach into the third. So the third of D7 is F sharp. We're going to start with a chromatic note above F sharp, and then we're going to play 2 chromatic notes below, leading up into F sharp, which is, like I said, the third of the chord. Okay. Next, we're going to play a diatonic above, chromatic below enclosure of the fifth. And then we're going to play a 3-note diatonic approach down to the root. Next bar jumps up to the fifth, and then a 2-note diatonic approach down to the root, and then down to its chromatic lower neighbor, and back up, and then just a diatonic approach into the third, a diatonic approach into the root, and next we're going to be approaching the third of C7 with another one of those 1 above, 2 below approaches. So the third of C7 is E. We're going to approach it with a step above, which is F, and then 2 notes from below. All right. Now that we're on the third of C7, we're going to continue up the chord. We play the fifth, and then the root, and then we're up to the third, and then we go up to the third's upper neighbor, but before resolving it, we jump to the lower neighbor and then back to the upper neighbor before finally getting back down to the third. Now we're still on C7. We're going to play a 3-note chromatic approach down to the root. Okay. Next we're going to F7. So we're going to play a chromatic enclosure of the third. So we're targeting A. So we're going to play a half step above A, a half step below A, and then now we are on the third of F7. Going to continue up the chord, up to the fifth, and then now we're going to play a 2-note chromatic approach down to the root. And then now a 2-note chromatic approach up to the third. And now a 3-note chromatic approach down to the root. So that was kind of a lot of chromatic notes in there, right? Let's listen to that little phrase again. Cool. And then we finish off this example by climbing up our F chord, and then we're going to play just 1 note down into the root of B flat. Okay, cool. Let's hear that a tempo one more time. 1, 2, 1, 2. 1, 2. Okay, this one starts off with a 2-note chromatic approach down into the 5th of D7. Then we just jump down 1 chord tone, and then we play a chromatic below, diatonic above approach into the root. So we're targeting this D, so we're going to start with a chromatic note below, and then a diatonic note above, and then down into the D. Then we jump up an octave, and we play a 2-note chromatic approach down into the root. And then we jump down a chord tone, and we're going to play a chromatic enclosure of the 3rd. So the 3rd is F sharp, so we're going to approach it by playing a half step above, and then a half step below, and then we land on the 3rd. And then next we're going to play, since we're leading into G7, we're going to play a 3 diatonic note approach into the 3rd of G7. Okay, so the 3rd of G7 is B, so we're going to play 3 notes down into B. Okay, next we go to the 3rd's chromatic lower neighbor, but before it gets a chance to resolve, it jumps to the 3rd's upper neighbor, and then back down before finally resolving to the 3rd. Then we go up a chord tone, and then we approach the G, we approach the root by playing a diatonic note above, and then a chromatic note below into the root. And then we play that same pattern. We go up a chord tone, and then approach the next chord tone by playing a diatonic note above, and then a chromatic note below, and then resolving into the chord tone, which in this case is the 5th. Okay, next we're leading into C7. So we're going to play a 2-note chromatic approach down into the root of C7. Then we jump down to the 5th, and then we play a chromatic enclosure of the 3rd. Then we jump up an octave and play a 2-note diatonic approach down into the 3rd. Next we play a diatonic above, chromatic below approach into the 5th. And now we're going to play a 3 chromatic note approach up into the 5th of F7. Jump up to the root, and then we're going to play a diatonic above, chromatic below enclosure into the root, and then jump down a chord tone, jump down another chord tone, jump down another chord tone. Then we're going to play a chromatic enclosure into the 3rd, up a chord tone, and then now we're going to play a 2-note diatonic approach down into the 3rd of B flat, and then jump down to the root. Okay, so let's hear that a tempo one more time. 2, 1, 2. All right, I got one more example for you. Here we go. 2, 1, 2. Okay, so let's take a closer look at what's going on in this one. We're going to start off with an out-of-order chromatic 2 below, 1 above approach to the root of D. So we're targeting a D. We start on C, which is a whole step below, and then jump up to E flat, which is a half step above, and then down to C sharp, which is a half step below, before resolving up into that D. Okay, now we're going to come down to the 5th. We're going to play a 2-note chromatic approach up to the 3rd. Jump up to the 5th, and then up in the next octave we're going to play a chromatic enclosure around the 3rd, down to the root, down to the 5th, 1-note approach down to the 3rd, Now leading into G7, we're going to be targeting the 5th, and we're going to approach it with a 2-note chromatic approach from above. And then do the same thing, 2-note chromatic approach from above into the root. And then we're going to enclose the 3rd up to the 5th. Then we're going to play a 2-note chromatic approach down to the root. And then we're going to play a 3-note diatonic approach down to the root of C7. Then we're going to go down to the lower neighbor tone, skip up to the upper neighbor tone, and then back down to the lower neighbor before finally resolving back up into the root. Then we're going to play a 2-note diatonic approach up to the 3rd. Then we're going to go up to the upper neighbor and back. And then a 1-note approach down to the root. And then leading into F7, we're going to play 2 notes above and 1 note below, targeting the 3rd. So we're targeting A, so we're going to play B, B flat, G sharp, A. And then down to the root, up to the 3rd, up to the 5th, up to the octave. So this is all just basic triad stuff. And then we're going to play an enclosure around the 5th. And then a 1-note approach up to the root. 1-note approach down to the 3rd. Jump down to the 5th. And then we're going to play a 2-note chromatic approach down to the 5th of B flat. And then walk down the chord. Let's hear that up to tempo one more time. 2, 1, 2. All the examples we went over today come from my book, Chord Tone Improvisation, a practical method for playing on jazz standards, Volume 1, Approaching Major and Minor Triads. So I'm going to leave a link for this in the description. It's available on Amazon. There's also a PDF available on my website, which is billgrahammusic.com. I'll leave a link for that in the description also. I hope you found this video to be helpful. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you have any questions about anything, please leave them in the comments. I think that's about it for now. Thanks for watching.